In Capstone 2, my group, including members Kathy Tolley, Julia Lee, Siobhan Pinkney, and Meredith Brock, forgive me if I didn't pronounce those names correctly, we never met in person, researched and wrote about child sex trafficking in a specific city in the state of Washington. Although I believe that our finished product was pretty great, I decided to change it up just a little bit and focus more on the state of Washington as a whole. I would like to start out with a brief history of domestic sex trafficking in the United States. First and most importantly, anyone can become a victim of sex trafficking. But there are some known factors that heighten one's risk of being victimized. Fadina, Williamson, and Perdue state that some of these factors include poverty, homelessness, substance abuse and addiction, mental health issues, and early exposure to sexual abuse and trauma. In Hackler's article, Inconsistencies in Combating the Sex Trafficking of Minors, he stated that while any aged child can be trafficked for the purpose of entering the commercial sex industry, the average age found amongst researchers is 12 years old. According to the Washington State Attorney General's office, minors were sold an average of 10 to 15 times a day, 6 days a week, totaling between 9,360 and 14,040 sex acts a year. Washington State has many appealing characteristics that would make it a go-to area for sex traffickers. Some of these include the fact that it shares an international border with Canada, has an abundance of ports, and has many wide rural areas. The state of Washington, along with many others, still sees minor sex workers not as victims, but as juvenile offenders, some of which are charged criminally for prostitution. This is a confusing concept among many, seeing as how the age of consent in the state of Washington is 16, and in others is up to 18 years old. I had stated earlier that the average age for trafficking is 12. How is it that a 12-year-old can be seen breaking the law through an action they cannot legally consent to under their accusing state's law? Minors should not be charged whilst falling under the code of statutory rape. Furthermore, majority, if not all minors involved in the commercial sex industry are victims of trafficking. Instead of facing judgment and legal action, they should be treated for their trauma and given the tools to heal. One reason this habit persists is because law enforcement is undertrained in trauma-informed care and the psychological effects a person can go through when being groomed into trafficking. By the time law enforcement comes into contact with a minor sex worker, they may not feel as though what they're doing is wrong, that they can be helped, or even want to seek help. But just because they don't look or act like victims doesn't mean that they aren't, so law enforcement needs to be trained to see that. One major issue with prevention and protection of trafficked youth is lack of communication and collaboration. Not only is this preventing helpful resources from being known to the public, but it also creates opportunity for trafficked youth to slip through the cracks. For example, if a minor were to walk into a pregnancy center for an abortion procedure, they would obviously be turned away due to there being no legal guardian there to consent, right? What is in place to ensure that the center contacts the authorities about a possible trafficked youth? Social and medical service agencies should work hand in hand with law enforcement in recognizing the signs of trafficking and reporting it to one another. They should also be partnering up to provide the most wholesome and well-rounded care to minors that are in the healing process post-trafficking. There are many local agencies in the state of Washington that already carry the knowledge and expertise which can be honed in upon to help this specific population, such as pregnancy centers, teen drug and alcohol rehab facilities, and counseling centers. Sex workers, especially minors, are at an extremely high risk of STDs, pregnancy, and malnutrition. Planned Parenthood would be an agency that state police and policymakers could reach out to see if they would be willing to donate their time, resources, and supplies for this population. Many trafficked minors are forced into a drug dependency early on. First Step Community Counseling Services, based in Kennewick, Washington, is an example of a counseling service that specializes in youth drug addiction and would be another beneficial partner for state authorities. According to Shared Hope International, 8 of the 112 minors trafficked from out of state into Nevada for prostitution between August 2005 and December 2006 were from Washington state. According to Thomas from My Northwest, police estimate that up to 500 teens, some as young as 12 years old, are working as sex slaves every day in King County. That is just one county in Washington. It would seem like it would be easy for this civilian population of that county to point each one out as they were to walk down the street. But the problem is, those who are trafficking minors are very skilled in what they do. They ensure that their workers blend in with the majority. Without the public being given the tools to assess situations and identify certain key factors that would expose a situation as that of child trafficking, it will be difficult for them to stop it. Minors who are involved in trafficking need to be treated as victims, not as criminals, so they can receive the adequate services they need. Not doing so can cause extreme problems for those who want to try and re-enter society to restore normalcy to their lives, especially if they have a criminal record of prostitution following them around along the way. If the state of Washington cannot pass a statute stating that minor victims cannot be criminally charged, then they need to be able to pass one that states that their criminal records can be automatically and permanently sealed, or even better, expunged altogether. If the states are wanting better looking statistics and less crime, they are going to have to meet those looking to leave that life halfway. There are currently no programs funded in the state of Washington that are funded specifically for minor victims of sex trafficking, even though children and teens require different types of services than adults, as they are still in the stages of cognitive and physical development. According to Barnert et al., Washington also has not followed suit with other states that are starting to grant criminal immunity to minors that are victims of sex trafficking, meaning that they will not be charged with prostitution if they testify against their Johns, meaning those who are paying for the services of that minor, and against their pimps. The promise of immunity can aid in the victims feeling comfortable coming to authorities and assisting in the process of speaking out against trafficking and helping to bring the actual criminals to justice. The help of the victim is also big nowadays, since the pimps no longer have faces. By that I mean that most of the recruitment, presentation of service, and transaction is now being done over the internet. Understandably so, this is making it extremely hard for law enforcement to keep up and to know who to keep tabs on. In some cases, using the cooperation of the once trafficked victims is the only way to receive that pertinent information. Police agencies are still new to receiving adequate training on trauma-informed care and other sensitivity training to equip them to communicate and help victims of sexual assault and trafficking. Once it becomes a consistent practice to make sure law enforcement is handling situations with victims in the best way, they will be more familiar with what further services that person may need. Public awareness of the sex trafficking of minors is key for prevention. It also has to be a combined effort between public and private sectors. Increased awareness among government sectors, healthcare professionals, nonprofit organizations, educators, social workers, and parents will ensure that minors who carry the characteristics making them most vulnerable to victimization can be identified and protected. There are many ways the state of Washington can bring awareness to the public. They can hold separate sessions at the local schools for faculty, students, and parents to ensure that each individual population is learning information related to their unique role. Being that it's 2019, media is most likely the outlet that will reach the largest audience. Police departments, nonprofits, and other agencies can purchase ads on Facebook, Instagram, and other social media outlets, as well as airtime on local television and radio stations. Trauma can have an unmeasurable amount of negative effects on an adult's emotional, physical, and psychological health. But when the victim of said trauma is a child or teenager, we are no longer just talking about their health, we are talking about their development as a whole. Trauma can stunt growth, interfere with the ability to learn positive attachment and bonding, create a predisposition to drug abuse and other criminal activity, and many other detrimental effects that are setting these children up to, for the lack of a better term, fail in adulthood. If Washington were to set aside state and city funding to create minor-specific resources and programs, they would have a better shot at cutting these risks at a significant amount. There is a recurring problem of slut or victim shaming in not only police departments, but in our society as a whole. This phenomenon causes those who have suffered from sex-related crimes to not want to come forward out of fear of ridicule or judgment. If this can happen among adult victims, imagine the hesitation that would come from a child who is already very susceptible to a heightened version of those emotions. Once everyone learns skills such as active listening and empathy, we can create an environment where victims, especially victims of trafficking where they are risking their lives to come forward, can feel comfortable and safe telling their story. Along with being met with blame, many victims are faced with threats of criminal charges and consequences. If anything is a deterrent to victims to not come forward, this is it. With the training mentioned earlier in the presentation provided to law enforcement, giving them adequate skills in trauma and characteristics of victimization, the state of Washington can reverse the belief that children used for the purpose of sex are criminals. In the first moments of a victim coming forward to law enforcement agencies are some of the most crucial. They are most likely already being searched for by their pimp and can face extreme physical punishment if found talking to the police. Protection and shelter should be offered to all minors coming forward, not only by social services, who will most likely be given custody of the minor at that time, but by police as well. Street team outreach is an important component to add to solutions that focus on protection and prevention of sex-trafficked minors. With close community involvement and strong ties to the street communities, minors will have direct access to resources, as well as trusting adults to come to for help. Street teams are facilitated by professional volunteers such as social workers, doctors, religious leaders, and those just the same. Due to the high likelihood of sex-trafficked minors becoming victims of future interpersonal physical and/or sexual violence, continuous counseling as well as health screens should be provided at no cost of the victim up until the age of 21. This is to help support victims to better cope with any trauma and health issues they may leave with, such as PTSD, depression, HIV, and hepatitis, and also provides resources to help them readjust into society. Washington local agencies need to team up together to learn more about the mental and physical health issues that can arise when trauma is not met and handled with properly. Audience question number 1. What other types of agencies or resources do you think would add to the outreach for underage sex trafficking victims that were not mentioned in the presentation? Were there ones that were mentioned that you feel shouldn't have been? As talked about in the presentation, Washington has many characteristics that draw sex traffickers. What are some characteristics your own state has that could be drawing that type of population? Do you know of any ways your state is working to end the trafficking of minors? What are some ways we can change the outlook of trafficked sex workers, regardless of age, from criminal to victim?